It was just after midnight when the bell rang from street Mary's church, a sound that should never have been heard because the church had been locked for years and no priest had walked through its doors since Father Donovan's death. Yet the ringing carried across the sleeping town of Hollow Creek like a warning from the grave and jolted awake the few souls who still lived near the abandoned place. And among them was Daniel Rivers, a 33-year-old carpenter whose small home sat on the edge of the churchyard, close enough that he could hear the echo rattle through his windows as if the walls themselves were trembling. And when he sat up in bed, he saw his wife Lillian stirring beside him, her face pale even in the shadows, whispering that she heard it too and that they should not go outside. But Daniel had never been the kind of man who ignored a noise in the night, so he pulled on his boots and coat, grabbed the lantern by the door, and stepped into the cold night air where the wind had gone completely still as though waiting for something to happen. The bell continued to toll, steady and slow, each strike lingering too long in the silence between, and Daniel crossed the short yard toward the gate of the churchyard, his lantern's glow flickering against the rusted iron fence that surrounded the old stone church whose roof slanted crooked from years of neglect, the windows boarded with planks. Yet the sound came from within the steeple, where no hand should have been able to reach the rope. And when Daniel pushed open the creaking gate, it felt as if the sound grew heavier, pressing into his chest like invisible hands. He was not the only one drawn to it, for across the narrow lane he saw old Mrs. Callahan wrapped in her shawl, clutching her rosary beads and muttering prayers with trembling lips. And farther down the lane came the sheriff, a stout man named Henry Cole, with his lantern and pistol ready, though his eyes looked more nervous than brave. They met at the church steps where the bell finally stopped ringing, and the silence it left behind was almost worse, for it seemed to carry an expectation, like something unseen was holding its breath. Sheriff Cole muttered that kids might have snuck inside, though his voice lacked conviction, and Daniel shook his head, saying no one had keys to the place since Father Donovan's funeral, and besides, no child would dare enter a church that everyone in town swore was cursed. The sheriff swallowed hard, his lantern shaking in his grip, and said they had to check anyway, so together they pushed against the heavy wooden doors, which groaned but gave way, sending a wave of stale air that smelled of rot and candle wax, long extinguished. Inside the church, the pews stood in neat rows coated with dust, the altar draped in a cloth that had gone gray with mildew. And on the walls hung faded paintings of saints, whose eyes seemed to glisten wet in the lamplight, as though watching them with sorrow or warning. And Daniel could not shake the feeling that the deeper they went, the colder it became, until their breaths clouded in front of their faces. They moved toward the stairs that wound up into the bell tower, each step creaking like a moan. And though Daniel's lantern showed nothing ahead, he felt the weight of eyes above, something waiting in the dark where the bell rope dangled. When they reached the top, the rope swung lazily as if someone had just released it, but no one stood there, only the bell itself looming overhead, its bronze surface slick with moisture that dripped like sweat, though the night outside was dry. And Sheriff Cole lifted his lantern high and swore he saw a shadow move just behind the beam, though when they turned together, there was nothing but stone and darkness. Then the bell struck once more, a deafening clang that made them both stumble, and Daniel swore he had not seen the rope move at all, as though the bell had rung of its own will. They fled down the stairs, boots hammering the wood, and burst into the church's main hall again, the silence following them like a predator. Mrs. Callahan still stood outside the doorway, whispering frantic prayers, but when she saw them, she gasped and pointed at their shoulders, and when Daniel glanced down, he saw streaks of ash smeared across his coat, though nothing had touched him, as though invisible hands had gripped him tightly while he stood beneath the bell. Sheriff Cole said they should leave and seal the doors again, and Daniel agreed, though he could not ignore the feeling that something had followed them down, something that still stood just behind them even as they locked the church again. That night, Daniel could not sleep, for every time he closed his eyes, he swore he heard faint ringing far away, like a whisper of the bell carried through his bones. And when he finally drifted into uneasy rest, he dreamed of Father Donovan standing in the pulpit, his mouth sewn shut, pointing one shaking finger at the tower where the bell tolled without end. At dawn, Daniel woke drenched in sweat and found Lillian pale and trembling beside him, saying she too had dreamed of the church. Except in hers, the pews had been filled with faceless figures, humming a hymn that made her ears bleed. Word spread quickly through Hollow Creek, and by morning the whole town was talking of the bell that rang with no priest inside, and though some dismissed it as a trick of vandals or the creak of old wood, no one dared step near the churchyard again, not even Sheriff Cole, who avoided Daniel's eyes when they crossed paths in town. But the ringing did not stop, and though it came less often by day, at night it always returned, steady and cold, until the townsfolk began to shut their shutters tight, hiding behind locked doors as if the sound itself could enter their homes. One evening, 3 nights later, Daniel returned home from his workshop to find Lillian seated stiffly at the table, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the corner where the shadow of the window frame touched the wall. And when he touched her shoulder, she gasped and clutched his hand, whispering that she had heard someone at the door while he was gone, someone who knocked softly but never spoke, and when she asked who it was, the knocking had come again in rhythm with the toll of the bell, though the church had been silent at that hour. Daniel held her until she stopped shaking, but inside he felt something unraveling, as though the boundary between their home and the churchyard was thinning. On the 5th night, when the bell rang louder than ever, Daniel could not bear it any longer. He told Lillian he had to go back, that something was wrong in the church, and it would not stop until they faced it. She begged him not to, tears streaming down her face, but he kissed her forehead and promised to return before dawn. He took his lantern and walked the familiar path to the churchyard, though this time he was not alone. For as he approached the gates, he saw 3 others gathered there, drawn by the same compulsion, among them Mrs. Callahan, the blacksmith Thomas Hale, and young Sarah Whitfield, a seamstress whose brother had once served as an altar boy. None of them spoke at first, but Daniel could see in their eyes the same hollow fear, the same gnawing need to know what rang the bell. Together, they entered the church again, and as soon as they crossed the threshold, the doors slammed behind them with a force that rattled the stained glass in their frames, plunging them into near darkness, but for their lanterns, which flickered violently as though struggling against some unseen wind. They moved as one toward the altar, where the air grew so cold that frost began to creep across the wooden floorboards, and there, kneeling in front of the altar, was the figure of a man in priestly robes, head bowed, hands folded in prayer. At first, Daniel thought it must be some intruder dressed in Father Donovan's garments, but when the figure slowly raised its head, he saw the face was sunken and pale, lips sewn together just like in his dream, and from the stitches oozed a black liquid that dripped onto the floor in slow, heavy drops. Mrs. Callahan screamed and stumbled backward, but the priest rose to his feet and lifted one hand toward the bell tower, and instantly the rope above began to sway, though no one touched it. The bell clanged so loud that their lanterns shattered, plunging them into darkness broken only by the faint glow that now radiated from the priest's chest, where his heart should have been. And from that light began to pour shadows, shapes that slithered across the pews, and filled the hall with whispers that were not in any language they knew. Daniel grabbed Lillian's rosary from his pocket, clutching it tight as he shouted for everyone to run. But when he turned, he saw the doors were no longer there, only a wall of stone, as though the church had sealed itself to keep them inside. The shadows began to take form, faces stretched long and screaming, arms too thin and clawed, dragging themselves from the priest's chest toward the living, and Sarah was the first to be caught, pulled into their writhing mass until her scream was cut off, and only her hand remained clawing at the air before vanishing into the dark. Thomas swung his hammer wildly, striking at the shapes, but each blow only made them multiply, and soon he too was dragged down,